Okay, do you see that at the very least the boundaries of Anton go out and come into existence, which is, oh,
Like
look
my
at that.
hand can
Whoa,
out
whoa, whoa,
of
whoa,
existence, like that.
Wow. That's exactly what's going on the quantum level, people. Right.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Amoral Philosopher YouTube blog. I'm here again with my friend Dima Zhivov. Hello Dima, how are you?
I'm doing good. Really excited about it.
Great, thanks for coming on the show again. And we continue to discuss the issues in philosophy of religion. Our last episode, we started to analyze the objections against the Kalam cosmological argument for God's existence. And as we mentioned in the last episode, we're probably going to need several episodes to cover all the objections because there are so many. So this is the second episode in the sequence dealing with the objections against the argument. And just to remind our audience, I'll share the presentation that we used last time. Dima, can you see this now?
I can.
Oh, perfect. Yeah. So hopefully our audience can see this as well. So this is just to remind all of us that the structure of the Kalam argument, which has two premises and a conclusion. And so what we did last time is that we started to examine some of the objections against the first premise of the argument. That is the premise that if the physical universe began to exist, then it was caused to exist by something else. And we looked at several claims in support of these arguments, which you can hopefully all see now on the screen. And so one of the objections that we didn't have time to deal with last time was the objection coming from quantum mechanics. And we said that we're going to start off by this objection today before we move on to the objections against the second premise. So Dima, do you want to start with this one and just walk us through what the quantum mechanics has to say on the first premise?
Yeah, sounds good. Sounds good. So the first premise, as you could see on the screen, says that if the physical universe began to exist, then it was caused to exist by something else. And you could see that the first line of support appeals to the so-called first principle of metaphysics, which in Latin states ex nihilo nihilo fit, which means out of nothing, nothing comes. So the idea here is that it is metaphysically impossible for something to come into being uncaused out of nothing. And so that's one line of support for premise one. And the quantum mechanics objection, if it works, it basically says, look, that metaphysical principle is actually not true. It is not universally, it doesn't have to be universally valid, right, that everything that begins to exist must have a cause, or something that comes into existence must necessarily be caused to come into existence. That when we attend to the quantum realm, we see that the so-called virtual particles pop in and out of existence in a random, uncaused sort of way. So the claim of the objector here would be that quantum mechanics gives us a counter-example to the principle that out of nothing, nothing comes. Mm. Look, here are virtual particles, and they are uncaused and come out of nothing. So deal with that, the proponent of the Kalam. So that would be the objection. Anton, do you have any comments on this?
Yeah, well, before I give any comments, maybe we should have a demonstration of how particles can come in and out of existence, out of nothing, because some of our viewers can now be wondering, is that really possible? We've never seen anything like that.
So watch everyone. This is how it goes.
Yeah, let me see if we can do it now. Mm-hmm. So let's see, okay. So let's see if I can demonstrate how I can come out in and out of existence.
Right.
Let's do this slowly.
Okay. Anton, whoa. Anton, first of all, you're not disappearing. You need to move in a kind of haphazard, random way. Then you'll start disappearing. Okay, do you see that at the very least, the boundaries of Anton go out and come into existence, which is, oh,
Like
look
my
at that.
hand can
Whoa,
out
whoa, whoa,
of
whoa, whoa.
existence, like that.
Wow. That's exactly what's going on the quantum level, people. Right. Okay.
Well, all right. So hopefully that proves something. I'm sorry I wasn't able to disappear entirely. I still have to work on it.
But one of the principles is that you know you don't actually control what happens in the realm, so it's all fine. All right, yeah. So we needed some silliness in our series because we are too serious about it all. But
yeah.
Anyhow, thank you, Anton, for a wonderful demonstration there.
Right, right. So what do we make of this objection?
Yeah.
I'm trying to think out loud here. So can someone resist that? Can someone say that, you know, we have the impression that this, or physicists have the impression that these particles come in and out of existence because they're not able to track them, and there's probably some problem with the experiment itself or the way it's set up, or maybe it's something to do with observing the particles rather than with their behavior. And so maybe you just have to work harder to be able to track them.
Yes, very good, very good. So, yeah, so this objection presupposes a particular interpretation of quantum mechanics, which is known as the Copenhagen Interpretation, or something similar to the Copenhagen Interpretation, which wants to say not merely that we are limited as cognizers. We're limited in our ability to predict the behavior and certain values, right, of the variables, like, say, the momentum of a particle in its position on the quantum level. That our knowledge of the quanta is characterized by uncertainty. And moreover, the more certainty we have with respect to one complementary variable or one part of the pair of physical qualities, like momentum, say, the less certain we are of the other, let's say the position of the particle, right? And so, so the Copenhagen interpretation wants to do more than that. And I think maybe what would make sense is for me to just explain a little bit what is involved there, and just, you know, in layman's terms. And again, I want to stress just how not an expert I am when it comes to this field. Sure. And I take neither is Anton, but I think it would still help the audience to kind of track with us this a little bit, and I'll do my best not to butcher the concepts in quantum mechanics. So if anyone in our audience you know, sees that I made a mistake or mischaracterized it, please do let me know, because I need to grow in my understanding of this fascinating area. But before I do that, let me just first of all say that even regardless of the precise interpretation of quantum mechanics, there is a fundamental response here that's available to the proponent of the Kalam, which is this. When usually people talk about that virtual particles, the so-called virtual particles, come into being out of nothing, they treat quantum vacuum, where this activity happens, as, it can be misleading to say that. And the reason why it can be misleading to say that is because quantum vacuum is actually not the absence of anything. In modern physics, quantum vacuum is actually a sea of fluctuating energy that has rich physical structure and describable by physical laws. It's not your colloquial sense of vacuum, where it's just the absence of anything. No, this is a physically rich structure we're dealing with. And in any case, particles would then have to be thought of as, you know, fluctuations in that sea of energy. So even from the get-go, I don't see how this objection gives us kind of an instance of something coming into being out of nothing. At the very least, even if you go with the indeterministic interpretation of the quantum realm, at the very least, what you have is the quantum vacuum constituting the indeterministic cause of the coming into being of some particle as the fluctuation of that vacuum. And if so, you don't actually have a proven counterexample of ex nihilo nihilo fit, right? So that's the most fundamental response that I think the proponent of the Kalam can make. This isn't, in fact, an instance of something coming into being uncaused out of nothing, because we're not dealing here with literally nothing in a sense in which we are dealing with when it comes to the beginning of the universe, which we defined as all physical reality coming into being. So that would be, I think, the most fundamental response. Before I move to setting things up for talking about Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics, which this objection presupposes in any case, any thoughts on that most fundamental response to the objection, Anton?
Right. So the idea is that there would need to be some physical preconditions that need to be satisfied for these particles to come into the existence. Even if we say that what happens is happens in some kind of a vacuum, there'll be some physical forces, some energy, and unless these conditions are physical conditions are satisfied, we won't actually observe particles, as it were, coming into existence. And so with this, with these caveats, the force of the claim becomes much weaker. They rarely come out of nothing, because there has to be some conditions for them to instantiate, right? And so basically the argument, the counter argument, loses a lot of its force when we look at it this way and clarify what we mean by nothing here, nothingness here. Okay, I think I'm clear on that, so I'm on board.
That's right. That's right. And in fact, I just want to say in general that this is what often happens when scientists explain their theory, right? And especially when they try to dumb it down to all of us, they might sort of, and especially they want to excite people and want them to sort of get a sense of the awesomeness of science and just how fascinating the discovery of this and that in science can be. And they want to make provocative statements. And often scientists might kind of overdo it a bit. So you, for example, you have Lawrence Krauss talking about the universe from nothing. But when you really press him what he means by nothing, it's not going to be the philosophical idea of nothingness as the universal negation. It would be some kind of quantum state, which he will go on and describe in terms of properties it possesses, in terms of energy, in terms of giving characteristics, physical characteristics to it. And then you realize he's not talking about philosophers' notion of nothingness, but is just using language in this provocative way. And the same thing, I think, happens when these quantum theory, which is super counterintuitive and complex, is dumbed down to us. But when you press the physicist, what do you mean exactly by vacuum? Do you mean the absence of anything? He will look at you like, are you kidding me? The quantum vacuum is a property of space to begin with. Space. So space has to exist, and and has this property, right? So anyway, right, yeah, that's all I wanted to say on that.
Right.
Okay.
And so moving on to the Copenhagen
interpretations.
interpretation.
Yeah. So, okay, I'm going to be a fool and try to represent what I take to be the debate or the issues. All right, so here it goes for all it's worth. Let's start with kind of classical or Newtonian mechanics to begin with, right? So we are familiar, for example, with medium-sized objects like cars and people and so on. And for any such object, normally, that we are interacting with, right, we can give precise definitions, or we could assign precise values with respect to complementary properties that it possesses. For example, momentum and the position of any medium-sized object that we come across. And the momentum, of course, would be the product of mass and the velocity of the object. And velocity itself is actually having to do with the direction and the speed with which the object is moving, right? So the idea is that on the classical view, you can always be precise with respect to those parameters. But what quantum physicists are telling us is that neat picture kind of breaks down when it comes to the quantum level. When it comes to the quantum level, and this is where Heisenberg's uncertainty principle comes in, there is a fundamental limit to the degree of precision with which we can assign values to these parameters. And moreover, there is an interesting relation there of uncertainty. So the more certain.
Oh, Dima, I think we're interrupted here for a second. Can you hear me?
To one parameter,
Yeah,
the less. Okay, am I back?
Back on, yes, back on.
Okay, cool, cool. So let me just repeat that according to the Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, the more certain the value of one parameter, like momentum, the less certain you will be with respect to the other parameter, right? Now, the Copenhagen School of Interpretation.
Oh, do you want? Lost you again.
This principle. Hello, Anton. Can you hear me?
Yes. You're
okay,
back on.
Sorry.
You're back on.
Yeah, that the Copenhagen School doesn't just think that this principle gives us a kind of the description of our epistemic situation with respect to our knowledge about the quantum realm. Rather, actually, it says much more than that. And this is where Heisenberg himself and another player that is thought to be kind of the founder or the father of quantum theory. His name is Niels Bohr, who himself was a Dane, hence the Copenhagen School of Interpretation or Copenhagen Interpretation. And by the way, both of them would probably disavow that kind of idea of a school and that they are just monolithically kind of in agreement. They were not in agreement, but still because of Bohr and how old and how important his interpretation has been and his connection to Copenhagen and university there, he was dubbed Copenhagen Interpretation. So what Bohr and Heisenberg would also want to say is, look, we need to get rid of the idea that the quantum realm, unobserved, has precise properties to begin with. That the quantum realm is that weird. If you want to talk about position of a particle, before you observe it and measure it, all you are entitled to say is that it exists in a kind of superposition. And this is where things become weird, because the claim would be that it exists in more than one position in space, right? And that and that's what they mean by superposition, that it exists in more than one place, right? And that's why, so in other words, indeterminism and probabilities is the right way to talk about the superposition of any state, quantum state, prior to observation. Right? Anton, are you there? I just see I don't see your video.
Yeah, yes,
right,
I'm cool. Here. I thought I would just give you the floor and then the screen, so to say.
Right.
But yeah, no, I'm here.
Okay, good. All right, no, okay. Right, so that's basically the claim. And this is where maybe our listeners have heard of the Schrodinger's famous cat experiment. This is where he comes into the scene. And what Schrodinger did, and a number of other physicists try to do, is to try to say, look, this is too weird. That the indeterminism is not what holds with respect to the quantum realm. Indeterminism rather more characterizes our epistemic situation. So that's how I'm understanding his objection, that he did not like this idea of superpositions because he thought they would entail some really problematic consequences. And this is where his cat experiment comes in, and our listeners will be happy to know that no actual cat was involved. So this is just a thought experiment. So imagine a box, right? And imagine that in it there is a radioactive atom floating around that has some probability of decaying at any moment, right? So let's just stipulate that's what's going on. Then you place also in a box a detector of radiation, and such that at the time of the decay, when a when a particle with high energy is emitted from the atom, that detecting machine would register it, right? But here's the twist. Moreover, you place a cat inside, and moreover, you place a flask of poisonous gases in that box as well. And the detector is so connected to the flask that the moment that it registers the decay of atom and registers this high energy particle, it will break the flask and the cat will die. But Schrodinger says, according to the superposition understanding of what's happening to a system that is isolated from observation, the particle or the atom, right, its state, exists in a superposition. But given its connection to our object, living object, the cat, it also means that the cat itself would be in a kind of superposition, in the superposition of being both dead and alive. So the cat, prior to our observation, opening the box and checking it in, is neither wholly dead nor wholly alive. And that seems absurd, right? And here, what's key here is the relevance of observation to the quantum, to the precision, right, that the values can take. And this is variously talked about, but like one way you could talk about it is that you collapse the wave function. You literally break the superposition, so to say, in which the state is, and you collapse it into a determinate state, all right, by the very act of observation, right? And we could kind of talk about why that has to be the photons that's emitted from the system, that you're interacting as an external entity to such a sensitive realm as quantum, and these are the results. Now, so here, again, the claim is that you're opening the box collapses the wave function, okay? So I don't know if you want to comment anything, but this kind of to set it all up, right, for us. And the key point in Copenhagen interpretation is that they want to say, look, this indeterminacy, these superpositions characterize the quantum level itself intrinsically prior to our observing it. We can't actually detect any them in that state, because to detect it we would have to observe it, but to observe it like directly, that's impossible. But we could infer it given the duality of the dual nature of particles that we have, namely that they sometimes behave as waves, sometimes behave as particles. And so because of that, we can infer certain things based on other things, right, about the superposition of the particles in an unobserved, isolated from observation situation, right? Now, just like Schrodinger, just like Einstein, just like David Bohm, just like Everett, a number of other physicists, quantum physicists, this interpretation was not universally accepted by everybody throughout. And in fact, there is some informal poll from the 80s, and then I think in 1997, if I'm not mistaken, that have been done where physicists were kind of were choosing which interpretation they prefer, and you could see a decline of Copenhagen interpretation. Like Steven Weinberg, I think would fall there as well. Like he would want to say, no, there are issues with Copenhagen interpretation. So in other words, there are alternative interpretations of the same data, that the same mathematical formalism that that quantum theorists can agree upon, right? That is differently interpreted as far as its physical significance, as far as what follows for the world in itself, what follows for reality, what follows for ontology, from how can these formulas or equations, in fact, relate to the world as it exists, right? Everybody agrees we could do precise determination using them, that they work, but there is no unanimous agreement about what that tells us about the world in itself, okay? And Copenhagen interpretation is just one interpretation among many, but it is old, and I want to say it is probably still the dominant view, but the tide seems to be shifting at present. Okay, so that would be kind of my layman's view based on my reading of the literature. But, and again, take me a little bit to the mathematical side of it, and then you will see that I wouldn't be able to interact with the material, but this is the dumbed down stuff that I am able to process.
Great.
Right. So the final point, Anton, is simply to say, out of the complete interpretations that exist, actually, surprisingly maybe, the vast majority of them are actually fully deterministic. That, for example, David Bohm's interpretation, if I understood it correctly, would point to hidden variables, which are just sort of put aside as irrelevant in Copenhagen interpretation, which might explain why is it that you have the phenomena that every quantum theory is trying to explain. So there are alternatives that I think are viable, that are empirically equivalent. That is to say, you could still do all of the calculations and all of the predictions using them. They're just alternative physical interpretations of the same core of this theory. I'm done.
No, that's interesting stuff. I just think we'll have to move on to the next objections given our time constraints now. So I think that gives us plenty of food for thought on the objections based on quantum mechanics. But now I would suggest maybe we should move on to examining the second premise of the arguments.
Perfect.
So I'll just try to share the screen again to bring back the argument itself. So as you see, the second premise states that the physical universe began to exist. So it's just this this statement that we'll be dealing with mostly today. And to start us off, I wanted to bring one objection that comes to mind. So so basically the idea is the following. The second argument is used to the second argument is used to claim that the physical universe did begin to exist at the same time. But in order for the theist not to get in the same problem as the atheist would get, the theist would need to deny that God in turn began to exist at some point in time, and would need to claim that God is sort of timeless and he or she or it was always there before the beginning of time, so to say. And then the objection that many people could raise is, why make that distinction? Why should we allow that the physical universe must begin to exist at a certain time while the God does not? And I think when we're looking at the statement of the argument itself, we brought several supporting arguments for the second premise, and I'm trying to pull them up here. I think this is the slide. So there were some philosophical arguments and some physical arguments, and obviously when we're talking about God, the physical arguments would not work because the theist would claim that God is not physical, is not material. So all that we have left is the philosophical arguments. But even granting that the physical arguments don't apply, wouldn't the same philosophical arguments then apply to God, to the claim that God must also come into existence at some point? And if so, then doesn't the sort of the second premise cut both ways and ultimately leads to the conclusion that God itself cannot be the so-called unmoved cause and also must have come into existence? And if so, what difference does it make to use the Kalam argument to claim that, the universe come into existence, and the same argument would apply to God itself and ultimately cause us to look for an explanation of how God came into existence? So, Dima, do you want to walk us through what the theist would say in response, or rather what the defender of the Kalam argument would say in response to that?
Yeah, exactly. Right. So I think here is what I would say in response to that, because I happen to be one. So here's what I would say in response. First of all, like you noted, the scientific reasons for thinking that the universe began to exist it would be a category error to try to apply them in the case of God as we defined him initially in our series, right? That God is a necessarily existent, omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent being. Theists traditionally have affirmed God's immateriality, that God is not composed of matter. So it just seems like those at least wouldn't apply to him directly. But I do want to say this, and I think this, hopefully we could just agree on that. A theist cannot have it both ways. So if there are arguments of philosophical nature that show that actual infinities are impossible, say, right? Or as a second philosophical argument, against actual infinites would have it that the formation of an actual infinite by successive addition is impossible, right? If God has either in some way an actual multitudes of which he's composed, or if we could show that the very concept of God essentially involves the existence of an actual infinite, or if we could show that the very concept of God essentially involves some kind of formation of an actual infinite, and those two arguments that we're using for the universe supposedly successfully show that the universe began to exist, then I completely agree. It would be special pleading. It would be ad hoc move on the part of myself or a theist to say, oh, but let's not apply that to God. Like that seems wrong-headed to me. I think honesty would then have to say, look, no, then they would have to apply, if indeed, in other words, the force of the arguments are there regardless of, for example, for the impossibility of an actual infinite number of things, regardless actually of which multitudes we're dealing with. Is it multitudes of, I don't know, persons in a hotel, or indeed something in the life of God, right? So in principle, I agree that there has to be consistency. What I would say, though, is this. I don't think that the concept of God essentially involves affirming an actual existence of an actual infinite number of things, or indeed the formation of an actual infinite by successive addition when it comes to God. So if you have any specific way to argue for that, then maybe you could raise it. But so I don't think there's any special pleading for God, because I don't think the philosophical arguments apply to God, as theists have always understood him. But if you have specific kind of ways to argue for that, before I will suggest some ways, if you want me to, I can come up with some ways and point to some ways people have tried to make that case. But if you have specific, Anton, line, then you can start with that if you want.
Right. Well, even if we don't go into like finitism and infinitism, if we just take the claim that, out of nothing, nothing comes, right? Which we use to argue for the claim that the universe must have come into existence. So wouldn't the same thing apply to God?
Yeah, good. So I would say no, because God has never begun to exist. It's as simple as that. God never began to exist. So the traditional concept of God is that God is eternal being and necessarily existent being, and that would be incompatible with the idea that being began to exist.
Right. But so
failed to exist.
Then this whole idea seems to be ad hoc and just begging the question in a way, because on the one hand we have this principle that nothing comes out of nothing, so always something must have a cause of its existence, and then you have a concept of a being which essentially comes out of nothing, or that has always been there.
Yeah, definitely not a concept of a being that came out of nothing by any stretch of the imagination. It would be a concept of an eternally existent being that is necessary and is a bedrock of metaphysical reality, that this is the necessary foundation. And maybe at this point, Anton, it would help me to just clarify which sources are used for theists to elaborate on the concept of God that is used, right? So we defined God in a particular way earlier in our series, but maybe I could just point to two sources of how a constructive work when it comes to conceptualizing God is done by theists, right? So maybe that would help, because then we can know, first of all, is it an ad hoc move at this point or not? And I would argue it really isn't. So first of all, so let me point to two sources that are used. One is for anyone who's not just a philosophical theist like but also like myself, a Christian, say, or let's say you could have a Jewish believer who is a theist, or you could have basically a religious monotheist. One source for their thinking about God would be tradition and scripture, right? So, for example, in the Bible, God is said to be eternal, self-existent being. So it says in Psalms like, you are from everlasting to everlasting, thou art God. Or he speaks to Moses in a burning bush. Maybe you remember that story of like, I am that I am. And that has always been thought to mean, I am from everlasting to everlasting. I there is no beginning to me, and that I am self-existent. And so that, at the very least, has always been a consistent view of sophisticated religious believers when it comes to these different traditions, Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. Quite apart, and this is key, this is where ad hocness challenge, I think, falls down, quite apart from the issue at hand, which is the use of this argument to show anything about the existence of God. Before Kalam argument came to be, religious believers within those traditions for centuries have already been on other independent grounds than arguing for the existence of God, believing God to be a particular being. Mm-hmm. And part of that just was their religious texts. But another source is the something called the greatest being theology. So this idea says that God, by definition, would have to be a being worthy of our worship, would have to be the greatest conceivable being. And then we use our intuitions with respect to what sort of properties such a being would have to be the greatest. And that kind of motivates a more refined conceptualization of the divine, right? And that led theists to say, look, a being that can go out of existence, whose existence is contingent, seems to be less of a being, right, than a being that exists necessarily, that does not depend on other things for its existence, and so on. So there were independent rationalizations to think that the cogent concept of God must include necessary existence and eternity. And I think that's how we defined it. And we did that quite apart from Kalam discussion. And that's why it's not ad hoc to then ask, with respect to a hypothesis of theism, right, what follows. Does it make sense? Sort of how the theist is reasoning, at least.
Yeah. But so you just pointed out to the consistency of the use of the concept of God being eternal, but I don't think that really addresses the ad hocness of the concept. As long as God is sort of the only being that's eternal, there's no other eternal beings out there, or is it?
Well, it depends, depending on your view of God's relationship to abstract objects. If they exist, if you're a Christian Platonist, like Peter van Inwagen, for example, then you believe that they're also necessarily existent entities. Right. It's just, and in fact, they were not caused by God to exist, if I understand Peter van Inwagen's argument, actually. But I don't hold to that. On my view, and the traditional theistic conception is that anything other than God exists because God, anything outside of God exists because God created it or in virtue of God. And so I think divine aseity, his self-existence, is incompatible with the existence of self-existent other entities than God. So I would agree, God is unique. And that has always been the claim of monotheism. God is unique. And the motivation for that has been his self-revelation in scripture and philosophizing about foundation of reality, right? That it has to be necessary.
And when you say about the philosophizing about the foundations of reality, basically the God's eternity has to be necessary so it can solve us puzzles like this one, such as where does the universe come, right? So we use the concept of God to explain how the universe came into existence. So the concept and the property of eternity of God is an explanatory device, or is it used to explain other puzzles?
Absolutely, I would
existence
say
of universe.
Exactly. So absolutely, it was used. Not only, first of all, it wasn't always used in the context of explaining data. That itself is a kind of modern search to try to use the God hypothesis as an explanation for this and that. Often it was used as for example, the eternity of God was used as a kind of, to show the different status that, let's say in the Old Testament, Yahweh possesses compared to other gods that were finite, that were more anthropomorphic, and or the gods behind the idolatry of Canaanite religion or what have you. Like the self-revelation in scripture, right, of God as I am that I am, is meant to be saying, look, I am in the category of my own. This is what monotheism is. And the context there is not natural theology. The context is not that there are atheists around that we need to be convinced with respect to God's eternity and self-existence
Yeah.
and never beginning to exist. And moreover, I think in the Aristotelian tradition, at least you have the idea that the universe is eternal, by the way. So not all Christians believe that the universe began to exist.
Right.
All Christians, Christian theists who know their creeds, know their stuff, have to believe in creation ex nihilo, or at the very least in the metaphysical grounding of the universe on God. Mm-hmm. But whether the universe itself had a beginning, that's something that theists can disagree. So yeah. I just think it's not an ad hoc idea that God is eternal, never yet exists. This right. has always been affirmed.
So that's the very point in question here, because here we're trying to prove that the universe is not eternal, unlike God's. But we're not allowed to make that move because of the philosophical argument, because of the physical arguments that apply. But then we want to claim that God is eternal, and I'm just trying to find if I'm someone else who's not a theist, and the claim is suggested that God is eternal, what would make us accept that claim, except for the fact that A, it says so in the scripture, and B, it helps us explain how the universe came into existence if we cannot prove that it's eternal. So what are can there be any other grounds for accepting the claim that God is eternal?
I think God's eternity follows from him being maximally great being. It follows from him being self-existent being. In other words, there are other attributes than, there are other attributes, right, that have traditionally been ascribed to God, from which it would follow that God's eternal, for instance, right? That have that logical connection to these other ones. And the motivation for affirming these other ones, like self-existence, self-independence, has other grounds than arguing about the beginning of the universe and what follows from that to theism.
Right. But isn't it like this other argument for God's existence, where you list, I forget is it ontological, or where you have all these different properties, and then you also claim that, well, the being that's so great also has to actually exist, right? So which argument is that?
It is the ontological argument.
The ontological argument, right.
It argues
so this is structurally would be just like the ontological argument, except that we take other properties of God to prove also his eternity, because so it's structurally similar. So you have to accept all these other properties. So unless you accept those, you cannot really use them to argue for God's eternity.
Well, let me put it this way, because I think what we're missing here, maybe this is where there is a misunderstanding. Your first point was that it would be ad hoc for a theist to just define God in the way that describes him as eternal.
Well,
right?
Not for a theist, just for anyone, obviously.
Oh, for anyone, okay.
Someone,
Yeah, but I think we could kind of place it in our dialectical context and say, like, for somebody like myself using the Kalam and ultimately hoping to use the Kalam, which, by the way, doesn't immediately get you to a God, right? We will talk about that.
Right,
but essentially wants to use it somehow in the cumulative case for God's existence as we defined him in the second episode. It would be kind of ad hoc, you're suggesting, to just say that God is eternal. And I think here's what I think is missed. Two things. One is we're dealing with the concept of God here. We're not saying, look, here's a being, and now let's say what is true of that particular, right? We are rather saying, look, here is the story of how a particular concept of the divine came to be. And the story includes other grounds than these dialectical contexts in which we inhabit, namely us arguing for or against God's existence and the implication that the beginning of the universe has for that. So it has some independent motivation for religious, philosophically minded theist, right? Quite apart from the immediate context. Now, if you remember when we talked about ad hocness with respect to different hypotheses that we're trying to evaluate and compare, what was absolutely prohibited was the creation of a concept purely and merely in response purely and merely to fit the data at present, that it would have absolutely no other motivations, that it wasn't on the table before we had this conversation, that it was concocted just to fit the data, which is why we said that it's not a best hypothesis that the demon wanted the dice to fall exactly as the dice did fall, even though it would supposedly, it would explain it cogently, coherently. Yeah, that's exactly the combination he liked. That's the combination that turned out. But we wanted a way to stop that kind of inference to the using the demon there as an inference to the best explanation, precisely because the ad hocness. That prior to the conversation, no one talked about demons having these likings of these numbers in the sequence. So similarly, I want to say a theist like myself is, we already had this concept on the table for other reasons, religious, other reasons than this particular one, which makes the ad hocness level not comparable to the demon that wanted a particular combination of
right. So basically you're saying that, you know, because the concept of God has been on the table all this time, all along, it's not ad hoc. But then
or it's, at least let's put it this way, it's not ad hoc to the same degree, because I would want to say ad hocness does not need to be completely absent for this to be part of the choice between theories, right? Because I think, look, think of, for example, evolutionary theory. There were a number of data that emerged that the evolutionary theorists would responded in a bit of an ad hoc way, but that's okay if it had other virtues.
But then someone who's not a theist would say, well, then your concept of God is not that unique, because there are other concepts on the table, and someone can say the concept of the universe has been on the table long before God came into someone's mind. And someone can say that, why not grant that the universe is eternal? Why do I have to grant the property of eternity to God and not to universe itself? Because remember, so before we get to the conclusion of the argument, and we get into interpretation of what it is that must have caused the universe into existence, we're not talking about all these properties that you want to attach to the being. So it might be the universe itself all along that's been eternal. So why do we need to bring that into picture to explain?
So this is where now we're moving to the reasons why. First of all, now we're moving to the justification for thinking that the physical universe as we defined it in the beginning when we laid out the argument began to exist. There might be other conceptions of the universe. There may be other uses of the term universe which just wouldn't be even relevant to the arguments from cosmology, thermodynamic, multitudes that are infinite, and so on. In other words, I'm totally open. If there is another concept, I want to hear it. And I'm not using that concept potentially for arguing for theism in the cumulative case. But I want to agree with you on this, Anton, that I think that it's absolutely correct that the conclusion of the Kalam that the universe was caused by something else, and even after we do the conceptual analysis, does not get you all the way. So there could be all sorts of other concepts of God that are pertinent to that and might have been boosted, just as theism, I would say, is boosted by this argument. Now, I'm even willing to say that some of them might have been boosted in a greater measure than the theism being boosted. But remember, that just takes us back to that cumulative case approach and how we later want to talk about the probability of a theory compared to some other rival hypothesis on all of the data that's available, and not just the data that are relevant to the beginning of the universe. And at that level, you might still have theism winning over rival hypotheses. So that would be my
So basically, I guess your point is that if we operating on this concept of a universe which is entirely physical, and we introduce the concept
physical
of
reality,
a concept of God which is not physical, non-material, and eternal, then God is a winner, right? But someone can come and object and say that, well, first of all, it can't make sense what it is for God to be immaterial. And if God is immaterial, well, maybe I'll introduce the concept of the universe that's also immaterial, because if one thing can be immaterial, maybe there are many immaterial things, right? Then why is God any better than my immaterial thing? Just because it's been on the table a little longer? I don't know.
So let me, for example, just say, here's I think a good response. Okay, like I'm not going to contest the usage of words. I'm not interested in kind of that game. All I need is something like this. However, whatever term you want to use, my claim in the second premise and the first is all space, time, matter, and energy, unless we will want to talk about different terms that you insist must be used. And look, it's like this. Every argument presupposes some concepts. behind the terms that are used, right?
Mm-hmm.
And everyone using any argument would have to explain what he means. And once that's explained, you could discuss it, disagree with it, object to it. And it's legit to, for example, object, like you were trying to say, maybe there are some problems with immateriality interacting with matter. Or indeed, I don't have any position about some other sense of the universe which involves immaterial anything. Like I don't have any stake in there. My claim is about the observable universe, and that's what I want to talk about. What cosmologists talk about, that's where I'm interested in going with Kalam. Yeah.
Right. So basically, the point is about the different concepts of the universe which we may have. And so someone can say that, perhaps our sort of folk concept of the universe that we have is not in line with what the physicists mean by the universe when they try to explain the universe coming into existence as a result of Big Bang, etc. So what if someone came to us and said, well, my concept of the universe is just all there is, that's the universe. And, fair enough, maybe the physicist explained to me then how, the matter came into existence at some point, or, well, if not the matter, how the matter in the observable universe came into existence at some point as a result of Big Bang. But sure, there must have been something else before that. At least there must have been space, and that's just been always there. And I want to say that that's eternal, and maybe the physicists cannot just reject that hypothesis. Maybe they can deal with the matter, but not with the space. So I'm going to say that, that thing is eternal, and I'm going to grant it the quality of the property of being eternal, just like as you wanted to grant it to God. And then my concept of the universe would be in competition with your concept of God. So why wouldn't the same argument apply to both then?
Yeah. So what I would want to say is then it would just be a completely different argument, and I'm not interested in defending that. Like I would never use the Kalam where by the physical or by the universe. That's, by the way, why I specified physical universe, to kind of avoid one usage of the universe where it's just totality of everything. And the reason why I want to avoid it, it would kind of be begging of the question, right? In the dialectic between a theist and an atheist, to just stipulate that all there is just the physical stuff, let's say. Like that just is what all there is. Because all there is, more broadly, is a bigger, it's a broader concept than that of the universe. It's part of all there is. All there is on the theist view includes God's existence. All there is would be something like a possible world, right? And that includes the proposition having to do with God. At least that's what the theist would want to say. So that's why I wanted to make that's what the Kalam is arguing, is that, look, but there is something we share in common, the theist and an atheist. What we both can recognize is that there is such a thing as the physical universe. And moreover, let me tell you exactly what I mean. And then I stipulated all matter, time, and space. You could say, but then the cosmology doesn't validate that things beginning to exist. Let's talk about it. But it's quite another to say, you can't explain your concepts and argue for anything because I have other concepts that I also might attach to the same word, the universe. That doesn't seem to me to be even relevant.
Yeah, and then of course, I mean, some atheists, although not all atheists, of course, who are also physicalists, would say that, well, everything is physical. So your concept of something not being physical just doesn't make sense. It's incoherent, so it doesn't make sense to talk about it. But that, I guess, is a separate.
It's a separate argument. I'm willing to talk about it, right?
And I think we'll actually go into that when we go into the interpretation of the conclusion of Kalam, and we can talk about the God's materiality at that point. But in the interest of time, I think we should cover some more material as regards to the second objection to Kalam. So let me just look at what we could touch upon here. So I think we briefly talked about the different concepts of the universe. So I think that's dealt with. Another thing, I guess, that we wanted to talk about was that about the argument from cosmology that there exist other models according to which the universe is eternal and viable. So again, going back to our discussion a few seconds ago, is that to suggest that there would have to be a different concept of the universe, or is there another model explaining how the physical universe can also be eternal?
It's just to say that, in fact, the universe as defined did not come into being, did not have a beginning. So it's to negate premise 2.
Right.
And to say instead it is eternal. And here is a model that that preserves its beginninglessness, its eternity, and moreover, its eternity as you defined it, all time, matter, all physical reality, that there is no nothingness in the sense in which all physical reality beginning to exist out of nothing, right? Out of no prior matter, right? Would have us think, but instead matter is eternal in some sense, in some form. So it is absolutely directly relevant to premise 2. And if those models are cogent, if there is more evidence for them, then you can't successfully argue using premise 2 anymore. So what would I say kind of with respect to that? So I just want to say, look, again, this is not my area. Cosmology is not. I'm just interested in it. All I can do is point people to the relevant authorities. And that's what I did. For example, I pointed to Alex Valenkin, who was discussing in that video that we linked to in episode 5 in the description, who was discussing different models. And in the view of, I think it would be fair to say the majority, the universe is finite in the past. It's absolutely correct that there are models of eternal universe, but physicists are discussing it. And I don't think there's anything like as well accepted and as well received a theory of eternal universe as, let's say, something like the standard Big Bang model is. So all I can say is the evidence seems to point in the direction of finitude with respect to the past of the universe, and that it's incomplete in that direction, right? Geodesically incomplete, as cosmologists talk about. But and that's what it seems to me as a layman. But I would not be able myself to defend that. This is where Alex Valenkin could have a match with, I don't know, Sean Carroll. And in fact, he pointed to Sean Carroll's model of the eternal universe in the video. And he either said, I don't remember what he said exactly about that, but he said that the models usually of eternal universe have the following weakness. Either they still presuppose a beginning at some point against the claims to the contrary, or else they have other weaknesses. It's instability, there is no evidence for this feature, that feature. And again, physicists can also talk about ad hocness, can also talk about just complicating a hypothesis just to avoid a conclusion of the absolute beginning, which is puzzling. So that's, I guess, what I would say with respect to that.
Great. I'm just looking at the clock here, and I think we have just a couple of minutes because before we have to ramp up for this episode. I think there was another issue that we were thinking of going into that concerns the impossibility of the actual infinites. So I don't know, do you think the couple of minutes would be sufficient to briefly go into that, or
let me do my best.
All right.
Let me do my best and ruthlessly stop me. Just say, quit it.
Go for it.
All right. So you might recall the argument, right, that I presented, and that's one of Craig's arguments, philosophical arguments, for thinking that the universe is not eternal in the past, because the idea that the universe is eternal in the past would then involve the notion of an actually infinite regress of events in the history of the universe. And if there are reasons like universally to think that any actual infinite is impossible, then you have to dismiss that the universe, right, that is infinite in the past is an actually infinite manifold, right, or collection, or that it involves actual infinity. So that's basically the argument. And what I was doing last time is I was basically, giving illustrations, Hilbert's Hotel illustration. Please, for our audience, whoever's interested, go back, because what I'm about to say will not make sense unless you do watch episode 5. But here's where I want to say, I think that this is actually the weakest of Craig's reasons for thinking that that the universe began to exist. And the reason is, I am doubtful that you can generalize. So even if generalize from Hilbert's hotel is absurd, and however we understand what absurd even means in this context, is it self-evidence, like, or the fact that it's self-evidently impossible or something like that? Like, how do we even understand absurdity in this context? But granted the mathematical consistency of the illustration, everyone agrees, Craig agrees, and the objectors agree on that. The Hilbert hotel, if the mathematics is right, is exactly what you would have, right? If actual infinites are possible. But the move from that absurdity, even if one grants that it's absurd in some sense, to therefore all infinites, and in particular, the infinite we care about, namely temporal regress of events being actually infinite, move from a particular problematic set of infinites to all infinites, I think is difficult. The way that Craig defends it is to say nothing turns on the things that are used in the thought experiment. We could have infinite libraries, we could have of books, we could have infinite marble collections. And he's right about that. The precise things that are used in an illustration don't seem to matter. Where I'm not so sure is Craig's further claim that that's all you need to generalize it. And the reason why I'm not so sure is I think what's doing heavy lifting in our thinking about absurdity with respect to scenarios like Hilbert Hotel is not so much what are the items that are said to be infinite, but the different operations that are performed on those items, like checking out of the hotel, like adding infinities, like moving people around. If that is, on the final analysis, what is driving our intuition that it's all absurd, then it's open for one to say it's metaphysically impossible to move events in an infinite past of the universe around the way that a proprietor can move people in his hotel around. You can't just sort of switch metaphysically events in its history, right? In the past. That's not metaphysically possible. Craig's response to that was, but I can assign mentally a number to each event, and I can mentally imagine some events disappearing, and still there would be this weirdness of there's still the same number of elements in the collection, or there's still the same number of events. But that's about all he can say here. He can't actually claim metaphysical possibility to that operation of mentally imagining them being gone. And in any case, now we're moving away from metaphysics. Now we're going to sort of mathematical, pure mathematics. And it's like, well, we anyway agreed that it's consistent mathematically to talk about it. So where is the force as a metaphysical impossibility here for actual infinites of any kind? So what I want to say about this argument is to say, look, I'm critical of its power. I think that it has some, in a cumulative case against the actual infinites, it might have some weight as just to say, look, here's a class of problematic cases for an actual infinite. At best, that's what it can do. I'm doubtful that it can be so generalized. And I have much more confidence about the second argument that Craig uses, which is the impossibility of forming an actual collection by successive addition. And that's a different discussion, obviously.
Yeah. And just to sum up, what does this objection do to the Kalam argument? Because this obviously the impossibility of the actual infinitism was one of the arguments in support of the second premise. So does it sort of undermine significantly the second premise of the argument, or are there other arguments which you think are still strong for to make us accept that?
Anton, I love that you use the term undermine, because I think what in any case, this objection that I raised to the argument, what in any case does not happen is refutation of premise 2. We're undermining justification for premise 2. But that said, I think that it weakens it definitely. However, like I said, I think that causal finitism argument, which we will discuss, I think it's powerful, and it has the punch that actual infinites lack, which is that it's not just some absurdity that you're pointing to in the scenario, which is a little bit neither here or there. It really is person dependent, like what one finds absurd. Well, what if I studied set theory for years? I don't find it absurd. I live in that theoretical world. But rather there you have something like a formal contradiction. And if that's true, then the force is pretty strong philosophically, as I will argue. But you're right, it still weakens the cumulative case by taking one of its strands. At the very least, you can't use it with the same kind of confidence and bravado.
Right. But that said, the argument is still on the table. And so I think here we'll have to wrap up for this episode. And so in the next episode, we'll deal with the interpretation of the conclusion of Kalam's arguments and what objections one may come up with against those conclusions. So it remains for me to thank Dima again for being on the show today, and thank our audience for watching. We all look forward to your possible comments or objections or suggestions as to how to go further in this series. And we'll look forward to seeing you in our next episode, which will be released shortly. Thank you all very much. Thank you, Dima, and see you soon.
Thank you, Anton. Thank you.
All right. Bye.